let's say, formal opportunity to welcome them, I'd like to do so. So the three of them are Rick de Villiers from the University of the Free State, Department of English. His project is titled Control Z, Undoing Narratives. And then we have Louis Abedi Asante, who is from the Kumasi Technical University, Department of Estate Management. His project is titled Wetland Gentrification in African Cities, Implications for Urban Governance, Planning and Theory. And then thirdly, Sarah Gotzel from the University of Witwatersrand, the Curriculum and Social Studies Department in the School of Education, with a project on historical feeling, exploring the decolonization of history education. So welcome to the three of you, and they all three happen to be Izolomso Fellows, which is the early career fellowship program that we offer at STIAS. So they will be affiliated with STIAS as Izolomso Fellows over a 3-year period to conduct their projects. So we wish you an excellent stay this time around. So I now have the pleasure to call on yet another Izolomso Fellow to introduce today's speaker. This is Karina Venter. We have the practice here at these lectures to invite a Stellenbosch University faculty member to introduce the speaker. So Karina, although she is a STIAS fellow, and you will also soon discover the connection between her and Arghya, I'm sure. But let me briefly say something about Karina. She's a senior lecturer in musicology at Stellenbosch University and chair of the South African Society for Research in Music. She holds a doctorate in musicology from Oxford University, as well as an MBA from the Stellenbosch Business School, completing that program, top of her class, no less. Her research interests include music and violence, apartheid histories and aesthetics, critical disability studies, and inclusive innovation. So, as I mentioned, Karina is also an Izolomso Fellow at STIAS, where she's writing a book on trauma and abuse in South African music pedagogical and music professional spaces. So her work has appeared in several publications such as Social Dynamics, the South African Music Studies, and the Journal for Transformation Higher Education, and media outlets such as the Mail and Guardian and The Conversation. Karina, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Christoph, for that very generous introduction. So, to introduce Dr. Arghya Sengupta is an honor, albeit a daunting one. Daunting because trying to convey something about the many facets and the sheer scope of what he has achieved feels impossible in such a short time. I would need at least a shelf to house the many books he has written. I'd need a speed train and a revolving door to capture the speed with which he moves between the worlds of litigation, public opinion, policy, and research. And I would need a medal stand that looks suspiciously like an Olympic podium on which to display his many prizes and accolades. So it's daunting then, but it is also a profound honor, because Arghya embodies what a career in research and the legal profession could be in the ways he straddles academic writing and public intellectual work. Arghya is someone who cannot participate in normal life without wanting to change it for the better for everyone. He's someone with a vision for an increasingly troubled world. And here, let me quote from an article he co-authored for the Indian Telegraph, in which he considers matters related to freedom of speech and censorship. And he includes the article in the following way, and I quote, "Threats to freedom lurk everywhere, be they from religious groups, cultural traditionalists, or the politically correct cancel culture. Real change will come only through our own collective voice and choice in repelling these threats, not through facing down the barrel of a charge sheet. We must fight to remain a country of creators, not censors. We must fight to remain a country of creators. That, for me, resonates with a vision of what we need in this moment of troubled times. Now, I met Urgo in Oxford, where we both studied. Urgo arrived in 2008 as a Rhodes Scholar. I arrived a year later, confused, on the same scholarship. Now, at this point in my introduction, I'd like to be able to tell a story about our first meeting, perhaps a story at my own expense that would give you a sense of the sheer brilliance, but also the generosity and humanity of Urgo. I was tempted to make up just such a story for the purposes of this introduction. But the truth is, well, I don't have such a story, which may be just as well, because I suspect any real encounter with Urgo at that time would have left the younger and very opinionated me hopelessly outsmarted and perhaps even politely corrected over a beer or two. Urgo's research interests are in constitutional law and regulation of digital economy, areas in which he's published widely, both in peer-reviewed journals and the popular press. He has published 5 books, and these include single-authored, co-authored, and edited volumes. And let me just here mention the most recent 2 of his publications. So in 2024, he published a co-edited volume titled The Working of the Indian Constitution, and this is with Routledge. And this volume brings together contributions from photographers, legal practitioners, doctors, etc., on the ways in which the Indian Constitution works or does not work for people in India. So really a book that is a broad engagement that applies in ways to Indian citizens in thinking through the Constitution, what works and what doesn't work. He's also the author of many peer-reviewed articles and chapters. I counted roughly 20, and many popular pieces. Urghya works currently as the research director of Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy and Research. And today, he's going to wear, I suspect, his hat both as a historian and as someone who knows very well constitutional law, in a paper titled Lost Between Durban and Delhi, the surprising absence of Mahatma Gandhi from the Constitution of India. Thank you very much, Urghya.
Thank you so much, Karina, for that really effusive introduction. The honor is all mine. And your story is inspiring for the time when we were in Oxford, though we didn't have a story over a couple of years where I made you feel less smart than you were, thankfully. But it has been inspiring all through, and to see all the brilliant work that you're doing now back in your home turf in South Africa and Stellenbosch University. It's wonderful to meet you here, and wonderful to be introduced by you. So once again, thank you very much. And good evening to everybody. My talk today is titled Lost Between Durban and Delhi. So I'm going to dive straight in and take you first to Delhi. It's 9th of December 1946, and the venue is the Constitution Hall of the Parliament of India. This is the first meeting of the Indian Constituent Assembly, which has come together to draft the constitution for what will be free India. And the who's who of the Indian freedom movement are present there. There's Jawaharlal Nehru, who will go on to be India's first prime minister. the future Home Minister, several presidents, anyone who you can think of is there. But notably absent from that is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who, as the leader of the Muslim League, was holding out for an independent state of Pakistan and refused to join the Constituent Assembly. The League had been demanding a state of Pakistan, which the British had remained ambivalent to till that time. And so instead of joining the Constituent Assembly, it embarked on a program of what it called direct action, which led to large-scale communal violence, killing of both Hindus and Muslims in various parts of the country, including my home state of Bengal. And that violence was the exact antithesis of what India's freedom movement was about, which was essentially a non-violent struggle that was led, as we all know, by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Now, this is why the most conspicuous absence in the Constitution Hall of Parliament that day was not Jinnah or the Muslim League, because it was known that they wouldn't join. It was rather Gandhi himself who chose on that day to instead be in a remote corner of the far east of Bengal, a village called Noakhali, which most people in India hadn't heard of, which now falls in modern-day Bangladesh, because that was a place where the communal violence had been most rife. And he was there trying to bring peace. He was there, he stayed for a long period of time, and his effort was to actually secure peace on the ground. So this is why his absence from the Constitution Hall was not just a physical absence. It was also a portent of the absence of Gandhian ideas from the Constitution itself. So this is why I've always been surprised by the fact that the man who led India to freedom, whose followers filled the Constituent Assembly, who India anointed as the father of the nation, who is on every currency note in the country from the time of independence, was not present at all, either physically or in terms of his ideas, in the making of the Constitution. Now, to many, this might not be a surprise, because the fact is that constitution making and popular politics happened on different planes, and often have, not just in India, but in several parts of the global south. So, to me, the question is actually more intriguing, not in terms of the fact that why did all these people who followed Gandhi not include Gandhian ideas in the Constitution, but more interestingly, that Gandhi himself urged the nation to sometimes ignore them. And this is where it became more interesting, because as several commentators on Gandhi, and I'm not one of them, I'm just a constitutional lawyer, have said that Gandhi was a prophet, but one who lived in politics. He couldn't afford to be a pure Gandhian. So that's why in today's lecture I'm focusing on two Gandhian ideas. One, his idea of duties that individuals owe to each other and to the state, and what the state owes to individuals, and the idea of community and communities as a unit of governance. Both of these ideas were shaped during his time as a barrister and political activist in South Africa, in Durban and Johannesburg between 1893 and 1914. So having given you a brief glimpse of that, and I apologize in advance to anyone for whom this might sound very familiar, so I'm going to try and go over that bit quickly. I'm going to cut to the drafting of the Constitution of India between 1946 and 1950 to argue why these two ideas did not make it to the constitutional text. And finally, I'm going to end by offering some thoughts on what some Gandhian ideas, or more generally, decolonial ideas of constitutional framing could look like. I don't have an alternative model, I must confess, but I have some thoughts in terms of what that alternative framework might be. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to thank STIAS, Edward, Christoph, my cohort, something that Karina said particularly resonated, that we live in a very dangerous time. It's an unfree time, and it's a time when there's a genocide on in Gaza. And at this point of time, more than others, I think it's particularly precious to have a space like STIAS, which is a haven for freedom and free thought. And it's amazing that you all can do this and have done this for 25 years, and I hope that this continues. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Snehorshi Dasgupta, my research assistant, who's done many things, including put this presentation together. It looks nice because he's done it and not because I've done it. It would have looked very different had it been me. Anshul Dalmia, who's given me lots of inputs on South African constitutional law. To everyone who's joined online, and to all of you here for coming. So let's start our journey in Durban, where Gandhi arrived in 1893. He arrived in Durban as a barrister, and this is a story that many of you know, so apologies if this is repeating the script for someone. This was really the definitive period of Gandhi's life in terms of the development of his ideas. He spent, all in all, between 1893 and 1914 in South Africa. Fairly long period of time, at a time when he was in his 30s and 40s, so kind of formative periods of his life. And this part of his life has been most pithily captured by Nelson Mandela, who, when he visited Gandhi's birthplace as the democratically elected president of South Africa, he said, and I quote, "You gave us Mohandas, we returned him to you as Mahatma." And I think this is what this period did. This was really the making of Gandhi, and within all his various complexities. So central to this transformation from Mohandas Gandhi to Mahatma, which essentially in Sanskrit means great soul, it can be loosely translated into great soul, was Gandhi's conception of duty. And he writes, "The true source of rights is duty." He wrote this in his definitive book of ideas, Hind Swaraj, Indian Home Rule, when it was 1909, and he was on a ship back from London to South Africa. And that's when he wrote this, what is seen as kind of the main philosophical treatise that Gandhi wrote. He had been brought to South Africa a few years earlier by a Gujarati merchant, Dada Abdullah. Gandhi was a barrister, and Abdullah felt that he would be useful in mediating a dispute that he had with a fellow Indian merchant in Pretoria. And Gandhi, who was pretty much an out-of-work barrister in India at that point of time, he was not very successful as a lawyer, he thought that maybe this time would be of good use. And he said, "I accepted because I was fond of novel experiences. I love to see fresh fields and pastures new." So this is why Gandhi came, because he thought it would be an adventure of some kind. But when he came here, a rude shock awaited. As a colored person, he found that the most basic entitlements of man, available even in India, which was a colony at that time, were not available here. The most definitive moment, an inflection point, as he himself and a lot of Gandhian scholars have written, was at Pietermaritzburg station, where he was thrown off a first-class compartment because he was a coolie, and coolies were not allowed to travel first class. And so he sat on the platform shivering, not knowing where his luggage was, and not brave enough to ask anyone, lest he be assaulted again. And then he writes, and I quote, "I then awoke to my sense of duty. I came to the conclusion that to run back to India would be cowardly. I must accomplish what I had undertaken. I must reach Pretoria without minding insults and even assaults. Pretoria was my goal," unquote. This sense of duty, of trying to find his mission and achieving it, is a constant trope of Gandhian writings during his time in South Africa. When his time in South Africa was ostensibly coming to a close in 1894, because the case that he came for had ended, someone handed him a copy of the Natal Mercury, which was a newspaper, which spoke of how the government in Natal was introducing a bill called the Franchise Law Amendment Bill. And what this bill would do would be to disenfranchise Indians from voting in the Natal parliamentary elections. Needless to say, no black person was given the vote either, because both the population of Indians and the population of local black people would outnumber Europeans by a sizable margin. Gandhi assisted at that time in drafting a petition to Lord Ripon, who was then the Secretary for the Colonies. And it was a remarkable campaign of activism for a lawyer who had come. I mean, in today's day and age, we would call him a corporate lawyer, because he was essentially mediating a dispute in a commercial law firm. So for a person who's essentially mediating a private dispute to now rally around Indians and get 10,000 signatures was no mean feat. And so he thought his task was done. But then the trader said, and he writes again, that you yourself have explained to us that this is the first step. We therefore think it is your duty to stay on, unquote. So Gandhi agreed to this duty and stayed on, not just for this campaign, but for another 2 decades. And he advised the trade, his first action was to advise the traders to come together, and this was the result. The Natal Indian Congress, which was formed in Durban in 1894. This had taken inspiration from the Indian National Congress, which was formed in 1885, and would be a precursor to Gandhi himself taking stewardship of the Indian National Congress 20 years hence. By 1909, when he wrote that book, Gandhi was already thinking about freedom for India. In Hind Swaraj, he wrote about his vision for governance in India, and it is actually quite remarkable in how different it was from what we consider to be standard features of constitutional government today, anywhere in the democratic world. There was no separation of powers between the legislature, executive, and judiciary. There was no division of powers between the center and the states. There were no fundamental rights. There was no big government. Instead, what there was, and it's sketchy as a theory, but what there was a confederation of self-sufficient villages. Now, villages would be the basic units of governance in the Gandhian ideal schema. People would do what they were good at: cotton production, cattle breeding, running a newspaper. It would be self-sufficient. Needless to say, critics had seized on that vision. One, because it was impractical in some sense, and two, it was also seen as perpetrating caste, because the caste system in India, at its sanitized best, was a system of division of labor. But at its worst, and this is how it operated, it was a method to ensure that certain people continue doing menial jobs, namely lower caste people. So the Indian village, this kind of village that Gandhi romanticized, was actually, has been described in many places as a den of vice, and Ambedkar, who was the key chief draftsman of the Indian constitution, called the village a sink of localism. Gandhi had anticipated such criticism. He wasn't as much of a philosopher, as I said, as he was a practical man. He quickly realized that such a vision wouldn't work only in theory. He needed a model to kind of make this come real. And at that point of time, Gandhi had started a printing press. This was, again, there's a remarkable book by a South African academic, Isabel Hofmeyr, on Gandhi's printing press, which I really urge everyone to read if they haven't already. But he had started this printing press, the International Printing Press in Durban. And what he thought would be a good idea was to relocate this from Durban to a farm outside Durban, which was Phoenix Farm. And so he set up Phoenix Farm as a community where the printing press would run, and also it was Gandhi's model of a self-sufficient community. Later, he also set up one called the Tolstoy Farm outside Johannesburg. Now, each of these settlements, and I'll talk about them very briefly, was an experiment in communal living. Each farm had its residents who would have their roles and responsibilities. And clothing was Spartan, food was simple. This was, in Gandhi's words, his prototype for a self-sufficient village. Now, not everyone on the farm shared the same degree of zeal and enthusiasm towards community life as Gandhi did. His grandnephew is quite an interesting passage. His name was Prabhudas Gandhi. Gandhi had his whole clan kind of come across from India at various points of time. And Prabhudas, he was 12 at the time, and he's written this quite honest biography of his time there. And he writes, and I'm only going to quote a couple of paragraphs to give you a sense of what life on the farm was like. And so this is Gandhi in Phoenix on the top, and this is Gandhi in Tolstoy farm. Prabhudas writes, and he's there somewhere, Prabhudas, in one of those children in that photo. The following day, Bapuji, as Gandhi was referred to, came to Phoenix for some hours. He impressed upon us the need to start on a saltless diet from the next day itself. He paid no heed to the pleas of the elders to make some concession about a saltless diet. He made Sunday an exception to the saltless rule, but he repeatedly emphasized to us the imperative to have a saltless diet for the remaining 6 days. Moreover, he also gave clear instructions about the necessity of hard bodily labor of digging with a spade to be done every day in the searing heat of afternoon between 2 and 4 p.m. Unquote. So life on the farm was tough, and Gandhi was not a liberal when it came to the farm. And discipline for him was not a self-governing activity. It was very much the norm for everyone. And this was very much the central pillar of the Gandhian community, a set of strict rules on personal and communal behavior. It was difficult, and Gandhi realized that. He also realized that it perhaps wasn't capable of scaling up to a national level as government or a constitution might have to do. Prabhudas talks about the difficulties of discipline and the pull of temptation, which Gandhi understood as the limitation of his ideas. And Prabhudas writes again, we would enjoy Sundays fully. On that day, we were free from work and also from a saltless diet, which made our joy brim over. On that day, we would get spicy hot food at home. We would eat savories like gluttons to make up for 6 days of the saltless diet. And thereafter wander off afar, run, fly kites, and sometimes plant saplings in the garden. As soon as the Sunday evening came upon us, the immediacy of the next 6 days of saltless diet would grip us with worry. Unquote. Now, discipline, in this case, I was just delighted that our community in STIAS doesn't have a saltless diet, but has the most amazing food possible. But in Gandhi's case, discipline, in this case, relating to the use or non-use of salt, was the moral foundation of his key philosophical idea, and that is satyagraha, which is loosely translated as truth force, and is the kind of foundation of the non-violent struggle that Gandhi is known for globally. Now, this began as a tool in South Africa to protest against disenfranchisement of Indians, and also the pass laws in Transvaal later. It was founded on this strict notion of discipline, which enabled every Indian to do their duty. This was, as Isabel Hofmeyr calls it, an internal sovereignty. Gandhi was striving for an internal sovereignty that would free the self to do what was its duty. This is how the idea of community and duty came together. In this community, which was an idea of external sovereignty, the community would come together with each individual doing what was their duty. So it was a combination of the internal sovereignty of the self and the external sovereignty of the community. Now, his single-minded, I must mention here very briefly before I go over to the next part of my lecture, is that his time in South Africa was extremely controversial because his single-minded use of satyagraha to advocate for the rights of the Indian community alone has led to a lot of criticism. And most recently, Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Wahed, two South African academics, have written this book called The Stretcher Bearer of Empire, which pointed to the time when Gandhi started an Indian ambulance corps to assist the British during the Anglo-Boer War and also during the Zulu Rebellion. My lecture is not a biography of Gandhi's time in South Africa. I'm happy to answer some questions on that and also point you to some readings. But I will only say this, that there is a difference between the content of Gandhi's advocacy, which was always for him about resisting British imperial rule, and his methods, which, as another scholar, Shruti Kapila, has called it, were his techniques of mobilization. And his techniques of mobilization were much more eclectic. It involved open resistance, it involved supplicating to the British, it involved cooperating at some points of time. It wasn't always clear in terms of what method Gandhi would use. And I think that to draw very large conclusions from this, from Gandhi himself, who is an extremely complex individual, is a fraught endeavor. As Gandhi himself would say that his job there was to advocate for the Indian community. He had sympathies for Pan-Africanist causes, but they were not his. He was acting from a sense of duty. And now we know as a matter of historical fact that as Mahatma Gandhi, this is the kind of transformation that happened. This is Gandhi as a lawyer in Johannesburg during an earlier part of his time in South Africa, and this is him during the end. A kind of very stark visual transformation of Gandhi from the lawyer to Gandhi, the political activist. So a question then emerges that if these ideas were fully formed at that point of time, what happened to these ideas of duty and community when it came to the drafting of the Constitution of India? Why did they not find place in the Constitution, given that that is what Gandhi was actively advocating for when he wrote his book, The Hind Swaraj? The Constitution of India ought to have been the natural home for his ideas. But that wasn't to be. So when we jump to the making of the Constitution of India, and that is Jawaharlal Nehru at the historic Constitution Hall on the second or third session of the Constituent Assembly, just a brief background of that exercise. So the Constitution of India was drafted in 3 years, between 1946 and 1949. Now, it was a truly remarkable exercise, because if you were to imagine what the scale of this exercise was, you're talking about a population of 389 million people at that time. So that is, I would imagine, about 7 times the population of South Africa and all of Southern Africa as it is today. So a huge number of people. You're talking about British India, which was under the Crown, but 545 princely states, which were ruled by Maharajas and Maharanis, who were sovereign but not quite independent. It was kind of confusing territory. And then 22 languages, hundreds of dialects. Imagine trying to get all these people to come together and agree on a single document. And that was done in about just short of 3 years' time. And that was made possible by two, what I argue, are two intentional actions. The first is the fact that the Constituent Assembly, which was set up to draft the Constitution of India, was not a directly elected body. It was not elected directly by the people. After debate, it was agreed that it would be an indirectly elected body. By that I mean, the people had elected representatives to their provincial governments, and those representatives would in turn elect the members of the Constituent Assembly. Now, this had one advantage, which is that most of these were governments that were run by the Congress Party, which, like the ANC here, was India's party of the freedom movement. Now, so essentially it became an internal process of allocation within the Congress Party. And the Congress Party had two criteria for choosing who would be part of it. The first was diversity. It wanted people from different geographies, regions, religions, and people from outside the Congress fold as well to be part of this exercise. And the second is that it picked the technocrats, the lawyers, the professionals, because constitution making was seen as an exercise that was technocratic. Now, part of this was because of the fact that we tend to think of constitutions as entirely legal documents, not always as political documents, which they are fundamentally, but also because of the fact that at that point of time, this is 1946, India is on the cusp of independence. On 15th of August 1947, India becomes independent. So the politicians, the leaders of the freedom movement, are folks who are running day-to-day government. They don't have time to sit down and deliberate on constitutional principles. So which is why, though folks like Nehru and Patel, who are the big political leaders of the time, are part of the Constituent Assembly, they don't play a major role. The task of drafting the constitution is left to the lawyers. And lawyers set up a number of committees, and we have a constitution in 2.5 years' time. The second reason is that the uncertainty of whether the Muslim League would join the constitution or not was firmly resolved in June 1947 when Pakistan was announced, the state of Pakistan was announced. And from that decision, one particular thorny issue got resolved, which is that everyone agreed that India now needed a strong central government. Everyone, with some exceptions, but largely everyone agreed that India needed a strong central government. There should not be the chance that there would be another Pakistan in the future, another secession. So it was widely agreed that there would be a strong central government, and so with that, a key Gandhian idea of smaller local governments, those were nipped in the bud. And we had, and continue to have, in Delhi, a very strong central government that towers over the provinces. Now, a combination of the drafting of the constitution being a lawyer-led exercise and the political exigencies of which demanded a strong center meant that these Gandhian ideas, both of duty as well as of community, were politely but firmly cast aside. So the constitutional advisor at the time was a gentleman, a remarkably erudite man called B.N. Rao. He drafted the first text of the constitution, and to do that he went on a tour of the Anglo-American world to glean best practices of what could be incorporated from different parts of the world. He was appointed to that role because of his familiarity with the Government of India Act 1935. Now that act was a colonial legislation. The British were in power at that point of time. But that act was the closest that Indians came to a whiff of self-government. It was like a constitutional document, and Rao was very familiar with that document. The draft that he came up with was then presented to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who I mentioned earlier, who is credited as being the chief architect of the Constitution of India, another lawyer with degrees from LSE and Columbia, Gandhi's ideological adversary in some regards, who Gandhi himself had made part of the Constituent Assembly. So lawyers like me, as you know, we all love precedents and we love the familiarity that precedents breed, and so they opted for a constitution that was tried and tested in other parts of the world and in India. So 2/3 of the first draft of the constitution was taken from the Government of India Act 1935. A third of the constitution, as was finally enacted, was the Government of India Act 1935. Even when there was a departure, and there were significant departures in many places, one of the key ones, to take an example, is fundamental rights. The Indian Constitution has a set of fundamental rights, our Bill of Rights. Now, even there, while fundamental rights were given to every citizen, there were vast exceptions on what the state could do to restrain those rights. So if you were to take an example, Article 21 of our Constitution gives everyone the right to life and personal liberty, the fundamental cornerstone of any liberal constitution. But in the Indian Constitution, Article 22 allows the state to restrict the right by preventively detaining people without charge for extended periods of time. It's in the Constitution itself, because it was felt that we needed law, and order to ensure that we have a working democratic state. And I could go on with this list in terms of rights, but restrictions. So in some sense, this was the continuation, at least in law, of the colonial state, of a state that towered above, and now a citizen who was earlier a subject, but a citizen who remained below. So this was the fundamental architecture of the Constitution itself. Now, it had one thing going for it, which was precedent, but it had another thing that was going for it, and that was the fact that Gandhi himself was conspicuously silent when these developments were taking place. Now, as I said earlier, on 9th December, Gandhi himself was in Noakhali. This is Gandhi in Noakhali, a remote part of Bengal, in November and December, where everyone is meeting in the Grand Constitutional Hall in Parliament. He's there on a peace march trying to mediate between warring Hindus and Muslims. And to give you a scale, I mean, the numbers vary, but you're talking about, in this little part of the country itself, you're talking about at least 20,000 people who had been killed in the last 2 to 3 months in communal violence. And Gandhi said that it is not civil war, but we are nearing it. And his job was to stop it from breaking out fully. And he said at the time that the Constitution is a policy document, and no policy document alone can bring peace or freedom to the country. Now, after writing that tome in Hind Swaraj, Gandhi always kind of blew hot and cold about the Constitution. So when Indians came together for the first time to draft a constitution for themselves, unofficially of course, it was 1928. And a constitution was brought about by the Congress party. And Gandhi himself, when he was asked to comment on the constitution, commented less on the contents, but he urged everyone to see the thing through. This is not because Gandhi was not interested in the contents. When he wrote to someone, he said that he had gone through the Constitution and he found it, in his words, entirely Western. And he couldn't agree with most of its contents. But then he said that it was a logical outcome of the institutions that India had at present. And so it was, in his words, a tolerable constitution, and so everyone should see the thing through. In 1940, when the Congress met again, Gandhi proposed a resolution that Indians draft a constitution for themselves through a constituent assembly. And when he piloted the proposal, he did it not because he wanted it to be a kind of coming together of Gandhian ideas, but he found that a constitution was a convenient vehicle for what he called a remedy for our communal and other distempers, unquote. So he thought that the constitution would serve a key purpose, and that is unity. Unity amongst Hindus and Muslims, unities amongst people from various parts of the country. So in December 1946, when the constitution makers met for the first time, as I mentioned, the Muslim League was not present. And so Gandhi felt that it had failed in one of its most fundamental purposes, and that was to secure unity. But maybe that could be an opportunity as well for his followers to push through some Gandhian ideas. Now, this is where Gandhi is truly complex as a thinker, because it's very hard to be reductionist about him and say he's this or that. So Gandhi is saying on the one side, and many people, including myself, sometimes find him contradictory and if you were to be a little more uncharitable, hypocritical, that till 1946, in parallel, he had actively worked with a gentleman who was his follower called Shriman Agarwal to draft what was called the Gandhian Constitution for Free India. Now, Agarwal's work was based on the founding tenets of Gandhian philosophy, which is, as I said earlier, decentralized governments and rights contingent on duties. Now, these were based on a philosophical view that the Western binary between individuals and the state, the theory of social contract as we know it, was misleading. And in Agarwal's view, individuals were as much part of the state and ought to perform duties to the state, and the state must also perform duties to individuals. So if I were to give you an example from Agarwal's constitution, every individual had a duty to be faithful to the state. Individuals had a duty to not exploit other individuals, and the state had a duty to provide education to each and every individual. Now, if you were to think about it for a moment as a lawyer, this has some deeply problematic connotations. What does the duty to be faithful to the state mean? How is it going to be enforced? I mean, this opens up frightening possibilities, right? How is the state going to ascertain faithfulness? I mean, this is a problem. It seems like there's something going on here that you're trying to conflate two categories and you're getting to some place that you really don't want to be. Now, Agarwal also recognized this, and so did Gandhi. So they went back to the other Gandhian idea that you don't want a large state, you actually want small, close-knit village communities. So you have these small self-governing units in Agarwal's idea, and small units that's going to provide for whatever the village needs. So some version of Rousseau's direct democracy. Now, this was debatable in theory, but it was always going to be a non-starter in practice, because as we know, the political exigencies of the time meant that there was no time for an idea like this. And the idea of duties and rights, Gandhi himself sensed that you couldn't really force fit this idea of duties into a constitutional framework. So when Gandhi wrote the foreword to this book called The Gandhian Constitution for Free India, he was quick to subtly but surely deny the slightest hint of authorship. He praised the author for his efforts, but he said that the title may be misleading because it was not a document that he could wholly commit to, nor was this really a constitution. What it was some guidelines on the basis of which a constitution that incorporates Gandhian thought could be drafted. Now, it would be simplistic to say that Gandhi was forsaking his ideas for political expediency. At some level, he certainly was. There was certainly an element of that. But at another, he was convinced, as he wrote, that when the time comes, Indians would themselves embrace those ideas and make it a part of the constitution. Now, the concept of time in Gandhi is another interesting discussion. Many people, including Faisal Devji, Isabel Hofmeyr herself, have written on it, that Gandhi operated in a world that was closer to cosmic time rather than the human lifespan. He was infuriating to many of his followers because he called off things at various times when they were in their ascendancy, and he asked people to wait. And waiting is kind of a very fundamental trope of Gandhian thought. But for the time, 1946, 1947, the constitution had failed to achieve for Gandhi its fundamental purpose, that is unity. And the text could be left to the lawyers. And on 30th January 1948, Gandhi died. He was assassinated, as many of you know, by Nathuram Godse, who also said, rather ironically, that he assassinated Gandhi because Gandhi had failed in his duty as the father of the nation. He essentially held Gandhi responsible for partition, but again, with that symbolism that he had failed in his duty. So when on 26th November 1949, the Indian Constitution was finally adopted and enacted, Gandhians in the Constituent Assembly were caught in a bit of a quandary. So here's what one of them said. We wanted the music of the veena or the sitar, these are two Indian instruments, but here we have the music of an English band. That was because our constitution makers were educated that way. I do not blame them. Now, the Indian Constitution is a classic liberal constitution. It has separation of powers. It has division of powers between the center and the states. As a late afterthought, it also has some Gandhian ideas, some ideas that he was very attached to. So there was an endeavor that the state would make to prohibit the consumption of alcohol. The state would endeavor to prohibit cow slaughter. These were ideas that Gandhi spoke of. But they were all lumped into a chapter which was called the Directive Principles of State Policy, essentially pious promises, if you were to be charitable, or as someone else had called it, it was a dustbin of sentiment. And I think Gandhi, essentially, when it came to the constitution, was relegated to that dustbin, and that is where he remains. So to conclude, and this is the final part of my talk, this absence of Gandhi, how are we doing for time? Maybe 5 minutes more, Christoph? Yeah. So this absence of Gandhi from the Constitution of India, I think, is a particular instance of a more general phenomenon. In the wave of decolonization post-World War II, newly independent countries like India adopted, enacted, and gave to themselves constitutions that were tried and tested. That is an Anglo-American one in the former British colonies. This was a rational choice. The models had worked, and consensus would be near impossible if something novel were tried. There wasn't really a new alternative. Now, one of the books that I wrote a couple of years back called The Colonial Constitution, I was asked often that, you critique the constitution as colonial, so what's your alternative? And I must admit that I don't have one. And I must confess to that. 300 years of colonial rule, my own education in Oxford and India, sometimes more colonial than Oxford, means that there is a lot of unlearning that has to be done. So what I can do today is offer 3 thoughts to you on what the makings of that can look like. First, on frameworks. The very idea of law as an instrument of state control is not one in which Gandhian ideas of duties on communities and several other ideas from decolonial thinkers can be easily fitted into. When you try to do that, we get what we found in that constitution that I was describing. It's a constitution with really frightening possibilities. But if I were to take an example of one concern that has really confounded constitution makers from India to South Africa and most places in the global south, which is how can a constitution help in lifting people out of poverty? How can it help in putting food in people's bellies? Now, if you look at how constitutions have tried to answer that question, and I'll look at the South African example because it's held up as an example of a constitution that is truly progressive. The framers of the South African constitution provided for enumerated socio-economic rights to housing, health, food, and water in the constitution itself. Now, it was of course drafted in the 90s, so came much later, but to a lawyer, these are really radical suggestions because you don't put rights which the states cannot immediately enforce. But the construct on the basis of which these ideas were put in, and the intent is most certainly laudable, is that there will be an independent and effective judiciary that would champion those rights on the side of the people against the state. Now, this idea, it's not to say that some judge is independent and some other judge is not. I read in the South African papers every day some comment on judges, and it always seems to make the front pages in newspapers here. But the point is not about individual judges. The point really is that this idea that there is an independent judiciary that is somehow distinct from government is itself a colonial idea. So several scholars in South Africa, Joel Modiri, Sanil Sibanda, several others, have talked about how this framework itself needs to be rethought because it doesn't have local roots. Now, I have some sympathy for that, but we must be careful that post-colonial law and constitution is not pre-colonial law and constitution, because it's not as if there was some romantic past that we can hark back to. But I think arguments of this nature point to the future and not to the past in terms of work that we have to do, because decolonization is essentially about altering the balance between the state and the citizen. And though we, in the global south, as in these are countries that have freed themselves from the yoke of colonialism, the state still towers above and the citizen still is below. So I think that's the first point, that we need to think about what those alternative frameworks are, because there is a deep-rooted colonial imprint on our minds. So I'll end with just two quick thoughts on what that might look like. So in case you were wondering who these two people might be, the first is, this is from my current STIAS project. He is Radha Binod Pal. He is an Indian judge who was appointed by the government of India to be one of the judges in the Tokyo trials, which was the lesser known counterpart of the Nuremberg trials that happened at the end of the Second World War. Now, this is where the Japanese were charged for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of waging war. Now, Pal wrote what I think is a remarkable dissenting judgment. And I won't go into the details, but he acquitted all the Japanese war criminals, not because they had not committed those acts, but because of the fact that he said that the most egregious war crime in the Pacific was, in his view, the dropping of the atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he said that that is beyond the jurisdiction of this tribunal, and so the tribunal itself is a sham and illegitimate. And so he would acquit the accused. Now, to a lawyer, this is not a legally tenable argument, right? Because two wrongs don't make a right, very simply put. I mean, the Americans may have been guilty of dropping those bombs, but the Japanese were guilty too of a whole range of other activities. But I think what we have here is the seeds of some kind of articulation of what post-colonial legal thinking might look like, where law is not merely a set of textual rules, but that set of rules infused with the spirit of what is right. Now, today we will call that a moral argument, and I don't want to go back to some version of Plato's philosopher kings who decides what is right and what is wrong. I don't have an answer, as I confessed, as to what that looks like, but I think that there is something here in terms of what that alternative framework could be like. Second, on the nature of comparative work on decolonization, and I'll end with this and one other quick point. It's in my view that comparative work of the kind that we've done as scholars in law usually compares legal systems from one country to another. And one of the reasons why I think STIAS is so special is that we get to speak to people from various different disciplines in such an intimate setting. And I think the work of decolonization scholars, there's much more work that we have to do across different disciplines. And so if I were to take an example from Mamdani's work on, not Mamdani, the mayor of New York, but his father, Mahmood Mamdani, on decolonizing universities. And I think this is an extremely interesting article where he talks about, he compares Makerere University in Uganda with Dar es Salaam University in Tanzania. And he says that Makerere, as a classic colonial university, was designed for excellence, whereas Dar es Salaam was, in Julius Nyerere, another Gandhian who came to power in Tanganyika and then Tanzania, the university was about relevance. And I think that this is fundamentally about the frameworks of decolonization. And for those who are working on law and the Constitution, I think our effort is to try and understand what relevance for constitutions is in the global South today. I think today we emphasize on excellence to have a good liberal constitution, but I think we also need to focus on relevance. And third and finally, I'll leave you with this picture. This is from Thato Toeba. I apologize if I've got the pronunciation wrong. She's a Lesotho-based lawyer turned artist who won the F&B Art Prize this year, which I've reliably told is the biggest art prize in South Africa. My colonized mind made me ask immediately as to, is this art? That is the first question that came to me. I'm not sure why I thought of that. I don't ask that question of self-portraits, which I think is an odd form of art. But I did ask this question. But once you can get beyond that, I think that what you see here for me is something that is both beautiful and disturbing. It is disruptive, but it is also constructive. And it's trying to construct something new. And I think this is the task that anyone who's perhaps working in post-colonial law and constitution making has to do. I think fiction and art are leading the way. I certainly think in a Gandhian way that my duty is to try and understand what post-colonial constitution making frameworks could be like. Unlike Gandhi to his grandnephew, I won't tell you what your duties are, but I leave you with the hope that you will find it. Thank you very much.
Arghya, thank you. That was lucid in your exposition of the story of Gandhi's absence in the Indian constitution, and then ending on these three remarkable points and comments around the frameworks of decolonization and the work that lies ahead of us. Thank you for that. I'm pleased to open the floor for any comments and questions. We'll start with Dele. Before we do, I should acknowledge all those who have joined us online. We unfortunately won't be able to take your questions, but please use the comments function where you can post some notes, and we'll make sure that Arghya receives those. Dele is up first. Thank you.
You were talking about the absence of Gandhi from the Indian Constitution, which is a remarkable thing. Actually, it was the title of the lecture itself, and how provocative it is, that caused me to make time this afternoon to come and listen to you. I wonder if you could extend that a little bit to the increasing absence of Gandhi from Indian life. And after all, even the guy who killed him now has a shrine built to his memory in India. If you could explain what accounts for that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, sure, I'll take that. I think this is Gandhi is a complex man, and there is, as an Indian scholar, Ashish Nandi said, there are 4 Gandhis. This is an article I read a while back, but if I can remember this. So the first is the Gandhi who's on every currency note in India. That Gandhi hasn't gone away. As India has become more and more capitalist, I think that Gandhi is more and more conspicuous everywhere. So I think there is that. Then there is the Gandhi who is the thinker, and there what Nandi talks about is that there is a kind of wistfulness about that Gandhi, about his ideas. And I think your comment also comes partly from that place, that there are certain parts of Gandhian thought that haven't sort of permeated to the current day. The third is Gandhi, the anarchist. And I think this is a trend that is present in Gandhian thought. And Gandhi, the anarchist, and the fourth is Gandhi, the activist, and there are some distinctions between the two which I won't go into here. But if we were to take this category, this Gandhi is extremely inconvenient for not only the Indian state today, but the Indian state generally. So, for example, Gandhi had said that now that India had won freedom, the Congress party should disband itself. The Congress should go back to being a social movement. It should not be a political party. So Gandhi was inconvenient for his followers at that point of time. In today's day and age, and I think that's where the question is particularly directed at, I mean, Gandhi is particularly inconvenient for the dispensation in India because of two reasons. One is historical and one is more ideological. The historical reason is the fact that Gandhi was assassinated by Nathuram Godse, who was associated with the RSS, which is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the parent body of the BJP, which is in power in India today. So there is historical baggage that the present government historically has not liked Gandhi and holds him responsible for the partition of India. Secondly, ideologically, Gandhi, and particularly towards the end of his writings, as in Gandhi, the Gandhi that has traveled to the current age, is one who is talking about reduction of state power, who's talking about the power of the citizen and the duties of the state and the citizen. And that has remained inconvenient to not only the present dispensation, but also most governments in independent India. So what we've done is essentially kicked him upstairs and made sure that he's there on every currency note, and he's the father of the nation, so that he's kind of above it all, so we really don't have to engage with his ideas as much.
Great. Thanks, Delhi. We had a next question, Dani, in the middle of the audience, and after him, Buzz at the back.
Thank you very much for a hugely stimulating lecture. I really like the idea of the decolonization project looking to the future. And I just thought, as I was listening to you, a constitution, of course, is not just the document that is written, but what people make of it afterwards. And so my question is, would you agree that in Southern thought, both in India and here, quite a lot of the basic work of what has to still be done has been done to some extent. So it's not just, on the one hand, a Western document that people celebrated incorrectly as the ultimate when our constitution was made, or as Joel Mudiri would say, epistemicide, but it is something in between, where a new kind of thinking already comes. So I was thinking of the public interest litigation in India that was such an example to us, which then led into some way into us putting the socio-economic rights in the constitution. So there already is this idea from the South that, that points to the future.
Yes. So should I answer that? Yeah. No, I think there is there's much to be said about that. I think 2 points. The first is that I think scholars have done a great amount of work to try to adapt a framework that is essentially a framework that is a classic liberal framework to conditions that are conducive to the global South. And I think there's public interest litigation, as you've spoken of, is one of them. Now, if you asked me this question about a decade back, I would have wholeheartedly agreed with you on this, that we have tried to adapt something and we have tried to make it work in Indian conditions, or as the case is in South African conditions. But now I'm a little bit more cynical. I wouldn't go to the extent of calling it epistemicide as Modiri does, but I think that there is a question of a fundamental conceptual framework when it comes to what courts can do. And I think here the point is really about not about whether courts have sided with the citizen in some case or another, which they have, but in public interest litigation, but rather what courts are as institutions. And I think as institutions, constitutional courts, both in South Africa and in India, are intrinsic parts of the state apparatus. And I think the power of judicial review being a fundamental plinth on the basis of which constitutional democracy is constituted, I think is really troubling for me, because I think that there has been this journey where popular politics is happening on the one side and judicial review, constitutional politics is happening in a different plane. And I think that there needs to be a greater thinking in terms of how popular politics can become the everyday of the Constitution itself. The Constitution is a political document. It is not a legal technical document for lawyers and judges alone. So to that extent, as I would be a little bit more cynical. Where I would, however, agree with you is that something new is emerging and something new will emerge out of it. I don't think that you can, tear this Constitution up, throw it away, and get something else in its place. I don't think this will happen. So even when it comes to the Indian Constitution, as I've written in my book, I don't argue that India should have a new constitution. That's not my argument. So I do think that out of this, something will emerge, but I think that the journey to that is the journey to a different framework and not adaptations of the present framework.
Thank you, Dani. We had Baz next, right at the back.
Thank you very much, Arghya. You started by mentioning how this intimate space that STIAS is and in its interdisciplinarity allows for these kinds of conversations, but I think it's only possible if your hermetics and your thinking are accessible to outsiders, and I think you did a wonderful job there. I'm very intrigued by this idea of duty as a constitutional concept instead of freedom, because most liberal constitutions stress freedom, and freedom is quite often, at least in popular imagination, seen as something devoid of obligation, devoid of duty. Freedom is not having to do things, at least in popular arguments. And so bringing duty in, to me, that's quite wondrous. And my very open question, this is not in any way the start of a debate or an argument or anything, but I wonder to what extent Gandhi's thinking about duty as a fundament is informed by his colonial subjection. As a colonial subject, you're obligated, you have no rights, you have no freedom, you're obliged. You have duties. So to what extent is that thinking colonial?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question to which I don't have an answer, as in I'm not a psychologist, as maybe Lou Marie can answer this question. So I don't know to what extent that is shaped by his time as a colonial subject. But there are 2 points. The first is that I think it does have something to do. His being a colonial subject has something to do with this idea of duty, particularly in his time in South Africa and his time early on in India, as he talks quite a bit about being an obedient servant of the British Empire with a duty to serve the British Empire, including in the Anglo-Boer War. So which is why he decides that he can't go to the front line and fight, but he is going to set up an ambulance corps so that he can help the British and show his loyalty to the British Empire, which he felt was the best way to advocate for Indian demands. Controversial at that point of time, but so to some extent there may be some truth to what you say. And equally interestingly, and that's why I was looking at my phone because I have this quote, because it's also interesting that at the time when all this is happening, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is also coming about in 1948. And so he was asked at that point of time as to what he thought about this idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a classic liberal conception of rights based on freedom, as you were saying. And he wrote this letter to the director of UNESCO, who had written to him asking for his inputs. And he said, and this will be interesting, and I quote, "I learnt from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights to be deserved and preserved came from duty well done. Thus the very right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship to the world. From this one fundamental statement, perhaps it is easy enough to define the duties of man and woman and correlate every right to some corresponding duty to be first performed. Every other right can be shown to be usurpation, hardly worth fighting for. I wonder if it is too late to revise the idea of defining the rights of man apart from his duty." I'm not going to offer a comment. I mean, this is clearly a different framework, but maybe it has something to do with this being a colonial subject and something to do with being a good son.
Thanks, Buzz. We had Christopher next, and I see two further hands. Yes.
Yeah, Arghya, thank you so much for that very interesting piece. Now, your title, Lost Between Durban and Delhi. My professor used one time to tell me that a title is like a DNA marker. So I lost. By the time you rested your case, I had lost this DNA marker, lost between Durban and Delhi. Can you try and help me to locate it?
The title was meant to make Delhi and people like him come.
By the time you rested your case, I kept looking around, where have I lost this marker? Yeah. Then secondly, I'm just wondering, constitutional making in India was left to technocrats, the legal people. That's very interesting, unlike here in Africa, where the politicians, they guard that process like nobody's, the stakes are very high. Maybe a small rejoinder to that.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So, so I think this is something that I learned from my publisher about the title, is that don't go with the title that best describes your talk. Go with the title that's going to make people come or buy the book. So I'm going to leave the question. So I'm going to leave the question of the title there. But as far as the question of who makes the constitution, I actually, and I know that we will have some disagreement on this, I actually think that politicians should be making constitutions because the constitution is a political document. And I think that in India, of course, it was not as if it was just lawyers. These were the kind of lawyer politician, kind of person who's a lawyer but also a politician who's doing it, but above the rank and file of party politics. But the reason why I think that politicians should make constitutions, even though they might be doing a bad job and maybe doing it for partisan interests, is because of the fact that at the end of the day, it's the politicians who will run with the constitution. So there is no point in having an ideal type constitution which says all the right things, but then you have people who are going to, who are essentially going to violate it at every single opportunity. So yes, while I agree with you that everything needs to be in some element of balance, and you don't want politicians only saying that, putting in things that are party political promises. So you do want checks and balances in that process. But keeping a kind of Gandhian, some Gandhian wisdom in mind, which is to keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer, I think it's good to have politicians within the constitution making process than outside it.
Thanks, Chris. We'll have to do this next.
Thank you so much for that talk. I must say, it's quite exhilarating and something absolutely out of my field. So if I get you right, one of the things that you're highlighting is the fact that, you know, the current constitution has got this very strong eccentric flavor in it. And I think this is basically a question to you, as you basically look into this as a scholar. What would you think are some of the glaring omissions in the constitution that you think will be maybe a step towards addressing, I mean, it can never be perfect, but going towards something that is absolutely, I think, much more tangible than what it is?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll give you two concrete thoughts on what they could be. One is something that is there and should be omitted, and one is something that doesn't exist. So the first is that I think that, and I'm talking about it in an Indian context, so it may be relevant here as well. I think government needs to come closer to the people. This doesn't necessarily mean you have these village units, which are perhaps impractical. But let's take India as an example. India has a country of 1.4, now maybe we are just having a census, so it's possibly 1.7 or 1.8 billion people. Now, how effectively can you govern that country from one place in Delhi? Not very effective. So now what India does have is that it has a central government and it has 28 state governments. I think that what we need to have is that we need to have empowered and accountable local governments. Now I know that there's a lot of talk about local governments here in South Africa as well. I was just reading in the newspaper the other day as to how the Makhanda municipality is failing completely in a whole range of functions. And I think this is a story that I see in many countries in the global south, that you have local governments, you have that existing, but they neither have the power nor do they have the money in order to do anything. And that is because of the fact, and there may be many reasons, but one of the key reasons is because of the fact that there is a hesitation in giving too much money and power to local government because there is a tendency that they might be corrupt. I mean, this is a sense as to why you don't want to give power to local government, certainly in India. I can't speak about it here. But I think that this is something that we need to strongly interrogate, go beyond that kind of conflation that local government is corruption, because it is not as if the central government is not corruption. So I think first, we need to think about decentralizing government and taking it closer to the people. And I think second, we need stronger conceptions of rights. I think this is fundamental in today's day and age, that we have, as in several countries, as in we have a conception of rights, whether it is classic civil and political rights to free speech and expression, movement, and socio-economic rights, the growing jurisprudence of socio-economic rights. But I think in all of them, there are severe restraints on those rights, which are provided for in constitutions themselves, that the state can restrict those rights for law and order, for a whole range of purposes. And that is essentially it comes out of the uncertainties of a post-colonial state, that you're not sure where this is going to go. Is this experiment going to succeed? So let's try and ensure that the state is all powerful. So Jawaharlal Nehru, who unlike Gandhi, and Gandhi's biggest follower, India's first prime minister, is a liberal. He is a liberal, but as a liberal, he says that I need those powers for the state because the state will protect you. The state will be responsible for law and order, and that is what we need in a newly independent state. Now, 80 years on, I think that we don't need the state to protect us. I think the question is not the intent, he said it with the right intent, but the question is really in terms of trying to guarantee rights in the truest sense of the term. I think these are two things that we need.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll take two more questions, Lewis and then Sipukazi.
Thank you so much, Arghya, for... Okay.
Thank you very much. I think it's been a very interesting talk. So, I mean, the issues with constitutions across the globe is very evident. And in our parts of the world, particularly in Ghana, where our constitution was drafted by a military government that, eventually became a civilian government, but the constitution really had lots of issues, and to date, we still continue to debate constitutional matters. But my question is, if Gandhi were to be alive today, which aspects of India's constitution do you think, like amend or propose an amendment?
I would never ever make the mistake of trying to predict what Gandhi would have said or done, because that is a recipe for disaster. But I think he wouldn't be very interested in the constitution itself. I think if I were to give you an honest answer to this, it's 1909 when Gandhi writes his book, which has his constitutional ideas, which is called Indian Home Rule. By the end of his time, this is 1948, Gandhi is much less interested not only in the constitution but in the law itself. I mean, so there's a lot of writing about Gandhi as a kind of anarchist during that time, because essentially he's talking in a framework that no longer is the framework of the nation state. He's talking about duties that individuals owe to others in society. He's talking about what he calls the constructive program. So I think Gandhi, if he were to be alive today in India, he would be extremely disturbed by the communal violence that continues in the country 8 decades on. I think that is a negation of everything that Gandhi stood for. I think he would be disappointed in how powerful the government in Delhi has become vis-a-vis the local states, and what is generally seen as the degeneration of the moral character of the population. But I think the answer to him wouldn't really lie in the constitution. I think he would have possibly been fasting to death somewhere in the country, hoping that by his action he might make some people sit up and take notice and do their duties.
Lovely. Thank you. And then Sipukazi.
Thank you so much, Orgu, for a wonderful lecture. Maybe to start where you ended, that Gandhi wouldn't have faith in the constitution. And I wonder if by that you mean that he wouldn't have faith in the state, that the state is a project of violence, that it doesn't seem to me can be redeemed or decolonized. And so I do wonder if the kind of post-colonial constitution you imagine is possible within the context of the state. And do we have any examples of this, in the formerly colonized world where it's been possible to remake the constitution in the ways that deliver on these duties? And perhaps to the point that Baz was making about Gandhi's conceptions of duty, I mean, in the African world sense, it is a compliment for someone to say, when you have behaved in the way that the community approves, the person says, you have made me a person. So this conception of personhood that is entirely dependent on the community. I do wonder to what extent this African world sense was also foundational to Gandhi's conception of duty, because for me, it doesn't sound so strange to conceive of this state, to conceive of community in terms of duty. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, thanks very much. I think the second point is a really powerful one in terms of the fact that I think there's a significant element of community in terms of how duties are constructed and deriving your sense of self from the community itself. And I think that there are two different pulls in Gandhi. One is, of course, the community itself and what that does to the conception of self, and also in terms of an internal self-seeking. Gandhi is a prolific writer. There are his collected works go over 100 volumes. where he's writing about every aspect of his life in great detail, including, as everyone in India knows, his bowel movements. It's kind of in great detail because he thinks that each of these actions, that is self-regarding as well as in the community, are constitutive of the idea of the self from which the idea of duty emerges. So I think it's really powerful when you say that the African sense of what communities are and deriving your sense of personhood from that community must have played a significant role in his conception of duty. As far as the first question is concerned, I know of no example where I'm not a comparative constitutional lawyer, so with that caveat, it's not like I study many constitutions in great detail, but I know of no example where this idea of duty is present. I mean, the idea is present. It's present in the Indian constitution as well in a different form, but it's not a Gandhian idea. I'm not going to get into that at this point of time. But I think there is a larger point there, which is that is a post-colonial constitution possible without with the state in this present form? There is a wonderful book called Violent Fraternity, written by Shruti Kapila, a professor at Cambridge, where she also looks at Gandhi and violence. And another one by Faisal Devji called The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptations of Violence. And I think, for Gandhi, the state is a violent project, and by the end of it, it certainly becomes that. True to all things Gandhian, I must say here that there is another strain of Gandhian thought, Anthony Parel, who think that Gandhi believes in a coercive state. So I'm going to put that out there. But the point is that I think if you were to honestly ask me this question, I don't think the post-colonial constitution is possible with the form of the state as we think of today. I think that would be kind of my intuition, but I won't be able to say much more in terms of what it actually could look like.
Okay, that's a wonderful point on which to end, because it's an invitation for further conversation, which I'm sure we'll have plenty of. I wanted to thank the audience for all the wonderful questions and participation. Karina, once again, thank you for stepping in and for introducing. Finally, great thanks to Arghya for a really wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.